Hello students, this is a very short video on the Scalinous anterior muscle. This is also considered as the key muscle of the neck, okay, at the root of the neck, inferior neck, okay. As in the similar way we have learned about the hyoglossus muscle in submandibular region, okay. This is an important muscle of the neck. Now question is, describe the origin, insertion, no supply and action of this muscle. And then also, okay, it will have the relations of the Scalenous anterior. So we will have to write about origin, insertion, no supply, action, and lastly the relation of the Scalenous anterior muscle, which are important, being a key muscle of the neck. Okay. Now let us come to the answer. How you will start your answer? Now this muscle is also known as the lateral vertebral muscle. What do you mean by lateral vertebral muscle? That means it takes origin from the lateral aspect of the spine, cervical spine, okay, and as it is present on the side of the neck. Now this muscle extends from the, between the cervical transverse process. Let us see in this small diagram. This is the C3 vertebra, cervical third vertebra. Posterior tubercle and anterior tubercle of the transverse process is here, and this is again the C4, C5 and C6. This muscle is attached to the transverse process and then it extends laterally to that of the scalene tubercle of the rib. So it is on the lateral side of the neck, okay? And then it goes to the first rib, scalene tubercle of the first rib. So let us see the origin first. The origin of the muscle is from anterior tubercles of the transverse process of C3, C4, C5 and C6 cervical vertebrae. The fibers run laterally and downwards, okay? They run laterally and downwards, and then they are inserted on the scalene tubercle of the first rib. And this scalene tubercle is a small bump on the medial border of the first rib. This is the outer border or the lateral border of first rib. This is the medial or inner border, and close to the costal cartilage at its anterior end there is a bump, okay, that is a tubercle is present, and on this tubercle this muscle is inserted. So the origin is wide and the insertion is narrow. Now the no supply of this muscle comes from the ventral rami of the spinal nerve, from fourth cervical segment of the spinal cord, the fifth cervical segment of the spinal cord, and the sixth. So three ventral ramus, ventral rami of the spinal nerves extending from three segments of the spinal cord, C4 to C6, they come and supply the motor fibers, okay, to the motor fibers. That means the motor innervation is from the ventral rami between C4 to C6, okay. Now you can easily deduce the action of this muscle as it is coming from the lateral side of the spine towards the it is fibers are running laterally and downward, What will happen here? When the muscles of both the sides, that is scalene anterior or scalenous anterior muscle of right and left side will contract both on both the side, this will produce the flexion of the column, cervical column, okay, cervical column, because here now the muscle is acting where the point is fixed, and then it will pull the cervical column from both the sides, okay. So the neck will flex, so there will be the flexion of the head will bend down, okay. So it will produce the flexion of the cervical column. Now, if the muscle is acting from the origin side on both the side, that is between C3 to C6 cervical vertebrae, here the origin is fixed, then it will pull the first rib towards the origin, that means towards the vertebral column. So both the ribs will be elevated up, okay, and this is just reverse to that of the flexion of the cervical column. So it is an elevator of the rib, that is which rib? The first rib, okay, when this muscle on right and left side are acting together, as it is in case of the inspiration, okay, forced inspiration, the ribs are raised up, okay. So this is the Scalenous anterior will raise the first rib along with the Scalenous medius, which is also inserted onto the first rib in the posterior part, and the Scalenous posterior, this is which is inserted on second rib. So all the three scaleni, it will contract, they will raise the rib cage itself, okay. The ribs will be raised as it is in the forced inspiration. Now suppose if this scalene anterior or Scalenous anterior muscle is acting singly, okay, only on one side, and the insertion is fixed on the rib, okay, then it will bend the cervical column on the lateral side, which is called as the lateral flexion of neck. It will produce the lateral flexion of neck when it is acting unilaterally from one side only, okay. So this completes the origin, insertion, now supply and action of the Scalenous anterior muscle. Now let us see this diagram, and we will now learn about the relationship of this muscle, that is the Scalenous anterior muscle relations we will run. Okay, what are the relation of the Scalenous anterior muscle? We will learn what structures they lie anteriorly, what structure they lie posterior to the Scalenous anterior, and in the similar way what lies medial and to that of the lateral side, okay. So anterior relation first, okay, and for this use this diagram, and I will explain you first this diagram. This is the manubrium sterni, sternal notch is here, see this, you can see. So this is the sternum or manubrium sterni to be more specific. This is the clavicular notch, that means here the medial end of the clavicle forms the sternoclavicular joint. So clavicle is removed, okay. This is the first costal cartilage attached onto the costal notch here. So first costal cartilage, first rib, scalene tubercle, the medial border of the rib and the lateral border. This is the superior surface of the first rib. Now here you can see this is the right brachiocephalic trunk, which divides into the common carotid artery, which will run up, and this is the subclavian artery on the right side, okay, subclavian artery. Then in front of this, behind this sternoclavicular joint will be the brachiocephalic vein, which is also here having two tributaries, okay. This is the common the internal jugular vein. This is the internal jugular vein, and this is the subclavian vein. I have just pulled the subclavian vein, okay, little forward and downward, otherwise it lies here in the lowermost part in front of the Scalenous anterior muscle. This muscle here is the Scalenous anterior muscle. It is an anterior muscle, Scalenous anterior muscle, okay, which is gaining attachment onto the scalene tubercle. It is its medial border of the Scalenous anterior, and this is the lateral border of the Scalenous anterior. So this subclavian vein will lie anterior near its insertion, okay. Just I have pulled this in diagram so as to show you the insertion and its relation with the nerve, okay, that is the phrenic nerve which lies on it, okay. Now thus it is the subclavian artery. This is first part, the part which is lying behind or posterior to Scalenous anterior is second part of the subclavian artery, and this is the third part right up to the outer margin of the first rib, the third part of the subclavian artery. Then this another muscle which is going and getting attachment onto the first rib itself is this is the Scalenous medius. This is the Scalenous medius muscle is here, and here you can see this nerve trunks which are coming out. They are the trunks of the brachial plexus. This is the upper trunk, middle trunk, and the inferior trunk of the brachial plexus. Okay, right. Now I hope you have understood this diagram, and let us see the relation, anterior relation of this Scalenous anterior muscle. Okay, right. This is under cover of the clavicle. Okay, because clavicle we have removed from here, clavicular notch. So it is under cover of the clavicle, and at this position the medial most part of the clavicle in its medial 1/3 from its superior surface will give origin to the muscle what is called as sternocleidomastoid or sternomastoid. It is the clavicular head of the sternomastoid. They will take origin from the clavicle. So two structures lie anterior to the Scalenous anterior muscle, that is the clavicle medial 1/3 as well as the sternomastoid muscle which is taking origin from here. Then there is internal jugular vein. Now I said that this internal jugular vein will run like this, and this is the common carotid artery. Both internal jugular, common carotid, and deep to it will be the vagus nerve. All three structures they will run in the carotid sheath. So the carotid sheath will lie, but it will lie that part of carotid sheath which is containing the internal jugular vein. Okay, and this is laterally placed. Common carotid is medially placed. Okay, so the internal jugular vein within the carotid sheath will lie anterior to the Scalenous anterior muscle. Okay, and as I said that I have just pulled this subclavian vein downwards and medially, but in normal position subclavian vein will be covering to the this Scalenous anterior also. Okay, so this will be covered by subclavian vein. So if I just again revise what are the structure here which are covering, it is clavicle medial and the sternocleidomastoid muscle, then internal jugular vein, and within the carotid sheath then the subclavian vein, and then directly lying onto the surface of this Scalenous anterior is this nerve which is called as the phrenic nerve. So this is the phrenic nerve which is anteriorly related. Okay, now then it is also crossed anteriorly by these two arteries. Okay, and these two arteries they are branched from the thyrocervical trunk, from the first part of the subclavian artery, thyrocervical, and they give the two branches downward, and it continues as the inferior thyroid artery. So these two arteries which are crossing it anteriorly is called as the transverse cervical artery and the suprascapular. So transverse cervical, you please note down, transverse cervical and the suprascapular artery, they will lie anterior, which are the branches from the thyrocervical trunk, and the thyrocervical trunk mostly will continue as the inferior thyroid artery, but it is not in anterior relation. Now, what are the structures which will lie posterior to this Scalenous anterior muscle? Posterior. It is the roots of the brachial. Roots will unite to form the trunks. So, here it is upper root, C5 and C6, they unite of the ventral rami. They will unite to the upper trunk of the brachial plexus. So, the roots will directly lie hidden. I have just drawn a small part of C5 and C6 root so that you can get an idea that how the roots forms the trunk. So, here C5 and C6 spinal nerves, some ventral rami, which are the roots of the brachial plexus, will be there, and this is the middle trunk, which is the continuation of the seventh ventral rami. This is the lower trunk, which will form by the roots of the C8 and T1. C8. So these roots are hidden behind the, posterior surface of the scalenus anterior muscle. Okay, so these are the roots of the brachial plexus which are related. Now then, lower down, it is also related posteriorly to the second part of the subclavian artery. Okay, second part. And from second part, an artery will take origin, which is not shown because it is hidden behind, and that artery is called as costocervical trunk. That is called as costo. This was thyrocervical, and the branch coming out from the second part, which is hidden or lies posterior to the scalenus anterior, is costocervical trunk. So subclavian artery and its branch costocervical. There will be another posterior relation, and still posterior to the subclavian artery and little above, there is suprapleural membrane and cervical pleura. Suprapleural membrane and cervical pleura covering to the apex of the lung. They will be there into the posteriormost relation. Then more posterior to this, okay, and above, this is the scalenus medius muscle which will lie posterior. Okay, the scalenus medius muscle will be lying posterior to it. So, followed. So these are the anterior and posterior relations. Okay, of the first this scalenus anterior muscle. Let us go to the other two relations, which are the medial and the lateral relation. What is lying onto the medial border? Okay, medial border, it is the thyrocervical trunk, is very running upward along the medial border of the scalenus anterior muscle, and then above it will come the vertebral artery. Okay, again a branch from the first part of the subclavian artery. So thyrocervical trunk and vertebral artery, and the left side it will be thoracic duct. Okay, and on the right side it will be the lymphatic trunk, not drawn in this diagram, but they are also the relation on its medial side. These are the structure which will lie. What will lie onto the lateral side? See this lateral margin of the muscle, and these are the trunks of brachial plexus we have already seen. And then the third part of the artery, subclavian artery, they are on the lateral relation. So the trunk of brachial plexus and the subclavian artery, it will lie lateral to the subclavian and to the scalenus anterior muscle, scalenus anterior. This completes the anterior, posterior, medial and lateral relation of this important key muscle, the scalenus anterior muscle. Some of those structures are not shown, otherwise this diagram would have been very complicated. Okay, now but in this position you are able to see a triangle here, and this triangle is called as Scalini triangle, Scalini triangle. And this, in this triangle you can see that the trunks of the brachial plexus and the subclavian artery, the lower trunk of brachial plexus and the third part of the subclavian artery is there. Okay, it is the content of it is coming out through this triangle towards the axilla. They are coming and going towards the they pass through this narrow space of the triangle. That is the Scalini. Why it is called Scalenous, Scalini triangle? Because this triangle is bounded by the two scalenus muscle anterior and the medius. Okay, scalenus and the medius. Let us see the boundary of this Scalini triangle. Okay, anteriorly it is bounded by scalenus anterior. See this lateral border of the scalenus anterior, it is bounding it to the muscle, and as such the whole muscle is bounding to this triangle, the scalenus anterior. What is the boundary posteriorly of this triangle? It is the scalenus medius, this muscle, okay, scalenus medius. And then base is formed by the rib. See here, this is the rib. First rib, base is formed of this triangle is formed by the first rib. And apex, where the scalenus anterior is crossing to the scalenus medius superficially, okay. This is the apex of the triangle. This, I hope that you have understood the scalene triangle, and the content are, I told you that it is the inferior trunk of brachial plexus and the third part of the subclavian artery. Sometimes they get compressed when they within this triangle, when these muscles are under spasm, okay. So the artery and the plexus, I mean to say this trunk, lower trunk or inferior trunk can get compressed. This completes the scalenus anterior muscle origin, insertion, nerve supply, action, and relation along with the scalenus triangle. Okay. Thank you very much for watching this video.